I want to talk about how you got into philanthropy and why is that important to you and to us as a society? And then, your great work you're doing at Wells Fargo. So can we get into you were in city planning for an extended period of time,
Hmm.
over 20 years, right? Is that right?
That's correct.
And then how did you get into philanthropy?
Sure. So I've worked in public sector, private sector. I've run nonprofits. So I've always interacted with the philanthropic community. They've all always played a major role in public-private partnerships in the various cities that I have worked in. I was running the Economic Development Corporation for New Jersey's largest city. And I was approached about an opportunity to work at the Rockefeller Foundation.
Okay.
Initially hearing the opportunity, things were going really well in Newark. The opportunity seemed really large in scale because they were looking for someone to manage all of the Americas, North and South America. Um, and while it sounded great, I don't speak Spanish. And it was also just like I was like, wow, this it seems a little bit much for one person. And so I'd always thought about the potential of working in philanthropy, particularly and later on in my career. Probably it's kind of the last stop before retirement. It just the stars were not lined up. Again, I recognize their role and how important they can be, the flexibility of their dollars, the amount of risk that the philanthropic sector can absorb in a way that sometimes private dollars and government dollars cannot. But it just the timing didn't seem right. Fast forward, maybe about 3, 4 months later, the same individual approached me again. They said, "Otis, you were right. We decided it just doesn't make sense to have one person handle all the Americas. We're hiring someone for North America and someone for LATAM or Latin America and South America." Um, and I said, well, it still sounds great, but again, I don't speak Spanish, and because when they said North America, I assumed they meant all of North America, and they said, oh no, no, this won't cover Mexico. It will just be the U.S. and Canada. There's about 29 different cities that you would have to manage, 25 in the U.S., 4 in Canada. And as they described the role in which I would be doing both grant making and philanthropically kind of moving dollars in terms of investments around economic development, community development, and climate change. It just sounded like a phenomenal opportunity because it wasn't just grant making, but also direct service. We would be providing technical assistance and consulting to the cities that we would be working in, not just dollars. And as a practitioner, that was really exciting to me, right? I would often make fun of the philanthropic sector folks that, yeah, they write checks, but they seem to be disconnected, right? And because many of them seem like they either came from academia, which I have a lot of respect for academia, but it's a lot of kind of theoretical study and research, or they just came from great wealth, right? And because they had several letters after their name, or because their mom and dad were wealthy, they thought they knew everything. And as someone who, grew up with housing insecurities and food insecurities and other, um, but also had the pedigree in terms of Rutgers and MIT and the experience, I'd done the work. And so the opportunity to bring that knowledge to grant making was just an awesome opportunity. And so in long short, that's how I ended up in philanthropy, joining it was called 100 Resilient Cities, was a major initiative of the Rockefeller Foundation in celebration of their 100th anniversary. They did an open competition around the world that they would work with 100 cities to help them become much more resilient, meaning economically, from an equity perspective, community development, and related to climate change. And over 1,000 cities around the globe applied, only 100 won, and I worked with the 29, 25 in the US and 4 in Canada.
That's
That's how
fascinating.
I got
Yeah,
introduced into the philanthropic sector.
that's interesting. And if you don't mind me asking, Otis, what kind of money was the Rockefeller Foundation putting behind this initiative?
Sure. It was initially it was around 165 million.
Okay.
But I think by the time they were done, it was close to 200 million that had been spent to investing in those cities around the globe.
Okay, so that's approximately $2 million, per city.
Hmm.
So how, in terms of picking projects, I mean, that's a lot of money, and on one hand, and it's not a lot of money on the
Right.
other hand, right? So how did you decide where that money was going to be spent most effectively, Otis?
Sure. Well, what was really exciting about this initiative was that it was all about systems change. So, for example, we worked with each municipality to actually hire a chief resilience officer, and we paid their salary, right? We worked with each municipality to pull together a resilience strategy, so that often, and I had worked on the government side, I knew often the tyranny of the urgent, right? To prevent you from doing all those things that are important that you need to do because you're kind of chasing different urgent things that come up. And so, an entity coming in, providing not just a community of practice, meaning you were partnered with all these other cities that were going through the same initiative, but it was also a community of learning, right? And so that's what was really attractive to me about the work was that we were actually laying the groundwork for them to take over the work, right? Because there a lot of times it's not necessarily a lack of resources in many of these cities, it's a lack of prioritization and strategy. You get so caught up, as I said, in the tyranny of urgent that you're doing a lot of tactical things instead of strategic things in municipal government that will really help to set you up for the long haul. And this initiative was really about doing that, creating the infrastructure, the capacity, so that these cities could better leverage their dollars and attract other dollars. And so that's where so much of the money that we spent in those cities was really about capacity building, about how our dollars could help to draw other dollars in. The Rockefeller brand, was helpful also in helping to pull other philanthropic dollars in, and then that contextualized technical assistance and support, helping them to think real holistically and comprehensively around some of the issues and knowing what they could and couldn't do, right? We didn't try to say we're going to solve all problems with the city within each, but really in their applications, each city identified their kind of their top resilience challenge, right? And so we really tried to address those. So I'll give you an example. In the city of Boston, and as you know, I went to MIT, and I loved Cambridge. Did not have a lot of love for Boston, right? Because there was the level of racism there was just extreme, that I had just not experienced. Even in the Deep South and visiting family in the Deep South, it was really, really poignant. And so didn't have a lot of love. But I have to tell you this: the then mayor put in their resilience strategy, that they wanted to deal not just with climate change, and some of the economic community development issues, but their number one resilience issue, they said, was racism, right? And yeah, and they said, he made a quote, which I really appreciate. He said, "Look, he said we cannot be a global city and continue to be a racist city." Right? And this was a white mayor, as you know, in a majority white city that was calling out racism as a problem that was hurting their ability to grow and to prosper. And so part of our work actually was funding their chief resilience officer, funding some analysis, and system change, looking at their municipal policies around recruitment, retention, around procurement, and changing some of those policies, working with that mayor and their chief resilience officers, and their staff to really change some of the policies to help to create a more equitable city. And so those are the types of things where, particularly again, coming from a place where I had to figure out very early on how to make a dollar out of 15 cents, right? You can stretch $2 million in each city in a very kind of different way, if you're really smart about where you apply pressure, where you invest. And again, don't try to do everything because you can't swallow the whole elephant, as they say, and to be respectful of what each city identifies as their major challenge. And so that's how we prioritized how the dollars were invested in each city.
So Otis, how long, in terms of that project, let's say in Boston, you funded it for, basically $2 million. Over what type of period are we talking about, Otis?
Sure. So this was over a 2 to 3 year period in each of the cities that we did this work with them. And then the expectation, which we saw happen in 95% of the cities, after we stopped funding the chief resilience officer, because that role was funded for 2 years, the city then would pick them up because they started seeing, there was an ROI. And that was also part of the rationale there, that if we could show the city that there was a return on investment for having this staff member, and how this staff member could help them to do better work and to bring in additional resources, that we knew that they would then pick up the cost. And the vast majority of the cities around the globe actually did just that.
And Boston?
Hmm?
And Boston?
In Boston, yes.
So I mean, that was a success.
That's correct. And
Wow.
the position still exists. The organization that was 100 Resilient Cities, when it was spun off, is now called the Resilient Cities Network, and it's an independent standalone that's continuing to do this work around the globe. And Boston is still one of the cities, and has a staff member that is actively kind of doing this work in partnership with the mayor, the current mayor.
Fantastic. Well, congratulations. That's fantastic. Yeah, I
Yeah,
mean, to tackle, so that's a huge subject to tackle, and especially in a city, right, that has been entrenched in that mode forever.
right.
That's quite exciting. So then, all right, so you were at the Rockefeller Foundation for how long, Otis?
So about almost 7 years with 100 Resilient Cities. A new president came in and asked me to join. When I joined Rockefeller, Dr. Judy Roden was there. She was the president for 12 years. She retired. A new president, Dr. Rajiv Shah, came in, and he asked me to join the U.S. Equity and Economic Opportunity Team, which was doing work nationally. So not just the 25 cities within the U.S., but around the whole country. And again, awesome opportunity, particularly getting a chance to work with Debbie Wright, who, as you may or may not know, is just an icon in financial services, economic development. She was the head of the Harlem Empowerment Zone, used to be the head of the nation's largest African American bank. There are very few African American women in finance who she did not kind of shape and help in one way or another. So I got a chance to work with her briefly. Then she retired, and then I took over all of U.S. equity and economic opportunity at the Rockefeller Foundation.
So what did you, in terms of philanthropy and its impact, what did you learn from that time, Otis?
Wow. A number of different things. The importance of real partnership and of shared power. Philanthropy can be fickle, right? Because someone's coming with a check, and so there can be an imbalance between the grantor and the grantee. And that imbalance often results in the lack of real impact and the lack of real sustainable development. And so I think one of the things that I learned in my work at Rockefeller was how important it is to have a real partnership with your grantees, to do all the hard work in the beginning. It's like a real relationship, right? Before you get married, you really got to do all the due diligence, right? And figure out, is this the person that you want to be with? And if you take more time in developing the marriage, then there's a chance, right, that you're going to have a really long and healthy marriage. A lot of times people spend a lot of time on the wedding, right? In the same way that a lot of times people will spend a lot of time on getting the check out, right? And just kind of doing that initial grant, but not on the relationship management, the grant management, the partnership that can mean real impact in the communities that you're trying to serve. And And I think Rockefeller was just really bullish about making sure that you did all of that due diligence so that you
Hmm.
can have a real impact and collect real data, both qualitative and quantitative data, so that you know what impact you're having, that you can amplify that learning and help others, right? Because even a foundation as old and as wealthy as Rockefeller has limited resources, right? If you compare what Rockefeller or Ford or any of these major foundations give compared to like the federal government, it's a drop in the bucket, right? But if you take what you did and amplify it and share it out and scale it, many more people can learn from one grantee's experience than just that grantee and just that community. And those are some good lessons that I felt that I got at Rockefeller and that I try to bring to my work at the Wells Fargo Foundation, Wells Fargo Bank.
Hmm. So in terms of, I mean, that's a fascinating concept, the idea of developing what you liken it to a marriage, the really creating a bond with the people you're trying to partner with, right?
Yes.
So what kind of toll does that take on someone like you? I mean, if you're really investing, this time and energy with all these individuals that you're trying to build this strong partnership with, I would assume that's a lot of effort on your part, or people, or someone like you, right?
Right.
So how do you sort of, I mean, I guess you could sort of see the person who just sort of writes the check and say, call me next year, you know, uh, you sort of get yourself off the hook. But if you're totally invested, I mean, are there sort of limits to how much, you can do or your team can do, Otis?
Well, most definitely. It's again thinking of it in terms of when you make a capital investment on the for-profit side, right? No venture capitalist just writes a check and says, "I'll see you next year," right? Because there's a vested interest
Mhm.
in making sure that you get your profit, right? That you get your money back plus some. And there's a different return on investment in philanthropic investments, obviously, right? But there is that community impact, that economic development, that economic opportunity, that economic mobility, the community enhancements that require you to spend quality time. And so, yeah, it can be stressful and it can be time consuming, but it's also work that I care about and that my team cares about. And so work doesn't feel as much as work, right? When it's something that you love to do and that you're interested in. But of course, there has to be limits. There's only but so much you can do. You have to know your lane, right? You have to respect your partner. You have to recognize that if you're willing to make an investment in A, B, and C, and they're doing economic mobility work, there's a reason you're making that investment. You're not to do their job, right? But there are certain learnings that you can give because the two functions in life, to teach and to learn, right? And you have to be in a position to do both, whether you're the grantor or the grantee.
Okay. So why is philanthropy important, and what is the role it has played in the Black community, Otis?
Well, it's a great question. I think, as you know, particularly in the African American community, due to historic systems and structures of racism, we have not had a long run at economic mobility, right? So many Africans were brought to this country, they were enslaved, and then once freed, there was still Jim Crow and systems of structural racism that really prevented African Americans from obtaining and building wealth. And so, despite that, right, despite the lack of resources, there's so much data also already showing that the African American community has historically been just a philanthropic community, giving in both in terms of time and treasure to within their community, helping to fund schools and hospitals and planned communities. And so philanthropy, even in a time of great scarcity, has always been prominent in the African American community. Um, If your question though is, and because it can be seen both ways, both inside the African American community and for the African American community, um, I think philanthropy has also both benefited and been challenging to the African American community. So as I mentioned earlier, my bias related to philanthropists, where either they were coming from academia or from great wealth, often meant those two types, stereotypes of philanthropists often came with a benevolent racist kind of perspective towards how to invest in the African American community. And so there was, and when I say benevolent racist, is that, oh, we're going to help you poor people out. We will help you. You will never be equal to us, but it's kind of a pat on the head and sending a check type of benevolent racist approach to building up the community that I think, and of course that was not everyone that invested, but it was a lot of that rampant, particularly though because you did not have a lot of people of color in philanthropy.
Mhm.
Um, and even though there's particularly with the great history of historically Black colleges and universities, there were great scholars and great academic individuals and practitioners in the African American community. They often were not allowed, right, to be part of some of the larger philanthropic organizations. But as you started seeing in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, some of the larger philanthropic organizations opening their doors to African American men and women to be program officers and to work with communities in the ones writing the check and approving the checks and initiating the partnerships. You saw some wonderful investments and true partnerships that help to fund fund civil rights, that help to fund housing, that help to fund education. Spelman College, where my daughter is a junior, is actually named the Spelman is the maiden name of John D. Rockefeller's wife. And so, there are, and so you see some investments that occurred that made a lot of sense, and more that had a greater chance of sustainability and help to really build capacity when you saw more and more people that look like you and I being part of these organizations that brought an understanding, not just an academic understanding, but a lived experience understanding, experiential understanding, so that they could invest in a way that made a lot more sense. You see some of the greatest venture capitalists in the tech space come from tech, right? Some of the best investors in finance that have done financial work, and we saw more smarter, more strategic investments in African American communities when we had seats at the table and could help to give and deploy the philanthropic dollars in a way that made more sense for the communities that they were trying to serve. And that's why it's a privilege to be the head of one of the largest corporate foundations in the country and to be a person of color, and for marginalized communities to be built into the DNA of our mission statement, helping to advance those marginalized communities being built into the DNA of our mission statement, is it's an exciting time to be at Wells Fargo, and to bring this kind of perspective to the work that we're trying to do.
Perfect transition here. Wells Fargo. All right, you're at the Rockefeller Foundation. How did you get to the Wells Fargo?
Again, I was approached for an
Mhm.
opportunity. I was initially hesitant because of some of the reputational risks around Wells Fargo and some of the challenges that they had in 2016, 17, 18. And then it was funny, a mentor of mine, he said, "Well, you're not even going to talk with them?" And I said, "Well, no, I've heard certain things." And he said, "Just so we're clear, you're comfortable working at the John D. Rockefeller Foundation, but you don't have a conversation with Wells Fargo." And I had to laugh because he said, "Otis, every bank, every corporation, every foundation has had challenges with our community. It's about us being in it and of it, right? And whether they're on a path to change. And he said, so you interview them. Don't think of it. You interview them. And Adam, I have to tell you, I was really impressed. I don't know of any other bank, especially within the top 10 banks in the world, that has, every bank, every corporation, particularly in the Fortune 100, they'll have a chief equity officer or a chief diversity officer. And these people are usually paid very well, but they don't necessarily have a budget. They don't necessarily have a strategy. They don't necessarily have staff, right? They don't have a P&L, right? And so you're sitting there like, okay. And they almost never report into the CEO. What I was impressed with at Wells Fargo during this interview process was I interviewed with the head of what we call DSRI, which are Diverse Segment Representation and Inclusion. And the Latino male that ran it at the time, now it's run actually by an African American female, reports to the chief operating officer. I mean, the chief executive officer. They have a budget, they have staff, they have indirect staff as well in terms of dotted line. They have a strategy, they have metrics that they're judged by, and profit that they need to make. It to me said a whole lot, because again, I have friends and associates at other banks, other corporations, that it doesn't exist elsewhere. And so this said to me, even with the challenges that may have occurred in the past, this corporation is literally trying to actually change the systems, and to really bring in diverse groups, not just in terms of staffing, but also in terms of banking, right? In a real and substantive way. And that for me was the what pushed me over. I was like, I don't, again, not including at Rockefeller, there is nowhere else where I saw that level of sincerity in terms of it being actually built into the systems in a real way where there's accountability, and in the real way in which the person running it is being judged and the CEO is being judged about systems change. Because at the end of the day, Adam, as you know this, the struggle will continue, right? Structural racism, and systemic racism exist, right? And if we are serious about change, you have to put systems in place that are as smart and as intentional as those that created the racist practices that we've had to deal with for over 200 years. And I think, and for me, I was really impressed by that. And to be frank, the opportunity to run, I do more in grant making just within the US than the Rockefeller Foundation does globally, right? And the chance to move those dollars in a very strategic and systematic way was really just exciting to me, particularly seeing that there were systems in place at the bank that were moving them in the right direction.
In terms of now, you're with the foundation, and so do you feel that same type of enthusiasm? And obviously you must, but I'm just going to ask anyway, in terms of what the bank, Wells Fargo, is trying to do at the foundation as on the corporate side?
Most definitely. To be clear, also, so I have two titles. I'm the president of the Wells Fargo Foundation and the head of philanthropy and community impact for Wells Fargo Bank, right? And so my entire team, including myself, we're all part of the bank, right? So we're not a standalone. Obviously, when we're moving forward our foundation dollars, there's certain IRS rules that have to be very clear in terms of making sure that there's some arm's length between kind of the bank business and the philanthropic work. But on the PCI, or philanthropy and community impact side of the ledger of work that I do, those are not foundation dollars, but those are pure bank dollars that are being invested philanthropically. So for example, in 2021, we deployed 280 million through the foundation and 420 million through the bank, all philanthropic investments, right? And so yes, I feel that degree of commitment, both in the foundation and in the bank proper.
That's fantastic. That's It's interesting, and I don't want to go on this too long, but you said something very interesting, which I've, people kind of hesitant to talk about it. That's right. You have a corporation that has a diversity officer, an equity officer, and sometimes I wonder what that person really does. I mean, is it just a title that and I've talked to some, and it appears to me that in some of those situations it is just a title and not much really gets done. Um, that seems very frustrating.
Yeah. And at this point in my career, given the work that I've done, and the people who I've worked with, I did not want to go anywhere where I was going to be part of any place where they're just checking boxes, right? I want to have impact in my work. You spend so much time at work, right? You want to, and so I was really impressed with and continue to be impressed with the fact that at Wells Fargo, it's literally built into the organization. And again, I challenge you, Adam, and find any other bank, right, where that person is part of the operating committee, and that has that degree of authority, and input and impact. It doesn't exist anywhere else.
Yeah.
And not just at other banks. Major corporations, it just sadly it doesn't exist. I hope we can be a model, because I think this is how you go about real systems change if you're serious about the equity agenda, right? I think there are other banks that may do a better job in terms of advertising and spin, but there's a difference between form and substance, right? And I think we're not trying to put lipstick on a pig, right? Right? I think we're really trying to create real systems change, and really build up communities. And again, it's not even for a moral reason or an emotional one. It makes great economic sense,
Yeah.
right? It is more profitable for Wells Fargo to operate in a way that advances equity, period, right? And I get it. I'm part of a corporate foundation. It's not a family foundation. It's not a public charity, right? I don't have an endowment. The money I give away is money that comes from the profit of the bank, right? And so it is in our best interest for the bank to be profitable, right? And the bank can be more profitable if it is working in historically marginalized, underbanked communities, underserved communities. That's market share that
Yeah.
we can have.
So you've had a fantastic career. So tell me about advice you would give to a young person, about going into the field of philanthropy, and especially, kids of color. Why is that important? It's something that people don't really talk about. I mean, I don't think I've really talked about that with anybody about, why
Mhm.
go into a career in philanthropy. So why is that? How could someone follow in your footsteps? And why is it important that people of color, kids of color, get into this field?
It's a great question. So if any young person would ask me about this, I would say to them the same reason that people go into government or public policy or nonprofit work. I think they should also consider philanthropy. If you There's impact that you can have in all those sectors, right? And we need bright people who understand the work, who have experiential knowledge as well as academic knowledge to apply that knowledge towards this work. And we can't just all be doing this work on the government side. But it's important that we have people who care about our community, with an understanding of our community in government. We can't all just go into the private sector and ignore government, because public policy affects how private markets move, right? And are shaped and are influenced, right? And so yes, we need brilliant people in the private sector who's pushing an agenda that is understanding of. And I think in the same way, the philanthropic sector deploys capital, just as there are government grants and government dollars that help to advance economic development, community development, help to support strong businesses, et cetera. There's that philanthropic sector that is as important, or is important as well. And so I would tell them, to figure out what work you are trying to do, and then determine what might be the best pathway to do that work. So if you're interested in affordable housing, right? You could go into the private sector and be an affordable housing developer. You could go into the public sector, right, and work for a public housing agency, or work in a community development and housing agency, and helping to influence housing policy and zoning, and helping to ensure that the right public dollars go into affordable housing units, production and maintenance. Or you could also go into philanthropy, right, and help to invest those dollars into affordable housing. And so I would say, just as you are developing your area of interest, this is what I would tell a young person, keep your mind open that it doesn't have to just be A, that you have A, B, C, D, as options. And philanthropy can be one of those options. And I'm biased again. I do feel one should not go right from school right into philanthropy, right? Particularly because I think that it was great to have some experience first. That if you're moving large amounts of capital on behalf of your board, your organization, et cetera, it would be great if you haven't just studied it, but if you've done some of the work. But I think it's an honorable field. It's a great field. The potential to move dollars to help people is so wonderful. And the thing, if you think about some of the elected officials, right? They or people in government, sometimes they say, "Well, why do you love your job?" You know, when I see that shovel go in the ground, when I see that ribbon cut, when I see how good the test scores are at that school that I help to fund, you know, it is satisfying. And I can say many of those same things from the philanthropic sector. And so that's why I think it's a an occupation and a field that people should seriously consider.
Well, I had a wonderful conversation with Ken Jones of the MacArthur Foundation,
Yes.
and he said, Adam, he said, you'd be surprised. People say, philanthropy, that doesn't pay very well. He said, Adam, that's not the case. He said,
Yes.
there are a lot of well-paying jobs in this particular field, and whether it's tech, anything you could think of, it's well-paying. And so, would you concur with that?
Yes, I would, very much so. I've worked in nonprofit, I've worked in government, um, and I would say yes, the private sector, whether it's a foundation in terms of private sector or private sector, it does pay well compared to the governments or nonprofit. Yes.
So tell me then, in terms of financial literacy, financial health for young people, and obviously in our community, we haven't had a lot of that. How important is that in terms of what Wells Fargo is trying to do? Um, how do we go about changing that dynamic for young people, people of color, people in difficult circumstances?
I think it's really important that we really prioritize financial health and see it as important as physical health, emotional health. You know, it is one of our four top priority areas in terms of our grant making. Housing access and affordability, financial health, climate and sustainability are also part of those areas of focus for us. But you know, I think one of the ways that we go about it is just reprioritizing how you look at it, right? That don't see it as an elective, but as a core course, right? Um, One of my former board members at Rockefeller, she really was focusing in. She's a co-CEO of Ariel Capital, and she really kind of, in her philanthropic work, you know, she has been laser focused in and on financial health because she sees, you know, if you understand the dollar, even if you have less or more, there's so much more that you can do, and it affects so many different parts of your life. And so I just think that's how you change the trajectory of our community is if we start to prioritize health in general, right? But recognize that emotional, spiritual, physical, and financial health are crucial, right? They're not good to do; they are must dos.
So, if you wouldn't mind me asking, in terms of your financial literacy, could you share maybe some examples of your own personal situation, whether it's investing, savings, that that might be helpful for a young person?
Well, sure. I think, you want to, one of the things had to learn, right? Because again, I did not come from wealth, right? And didn't necessarily go into all this with a high degree of financial literacy until such time as I had to get baptized by fire, right? So to speak. But I would say one of the things is to pay yourself first, right? And what that means is kind of setting yourself up for your own financial well-being, and which includes, I try to, just set aside a portion of my earnings for savings, right? And a portion for investing. But before you can do any of those things, right, is to get to try to get to a place of zero debt, right? Or limited or low debt, right? Um, you hear people saying, "Oh, I'm investing." Particularly that's so easy to do now with some of the online investor things, and yet they have high credit card balances and high student loan, and the key is that you want to first be free, right? And I think so. Your number one priority is to try to limit debt or pay down debt as soon or as quickly as possible, and then save and invest and do it in a way that's proportional to where you are in life, right? You can take more risk as you're younger, in terms of how and what you're investing in, and you need to be more and more conservative as you draw nearer to that time, like myself, drawing nearer to that time when you hope to retire. But I think the key is really again paying yourself first and doing those things that are important to paying down your debt, prioritizing the long term as opposed to short term. That quick, those new shoes or that expensive purse or that overpriced brand new car, all can be really attractive when you're trying to keep up with the Joneses. But it was much more important is living a full and long and healthy life, and so making those right decisions that are thinking about the long term instead of immediate gratification are also so important when you're thinking about financial health.
Okay. So tell me, Otis, how would you then, and that was wonderful. Thank you for that. If you're 16, 15, 16, 17, and you maybe you live in the inner city, and things are tough, in terms of finances, how do you, what do you recommend for those young people, the kind of experiences, the kind of information that they should be pursuing, that can help them move down the path that you're talking about?
Adam, I gotta tell you, there is more access to information now than it's ever been in the history of humanity, right? Period, right? And easy access. And so what I would say to them is in the same way that one might, and I'm not being flippant here, but just in the same way that one might spend 2 hours looking at TikTok around how to do a new dance, right, and memorizing it.
Right.
To do that same thing around financial health, it's there are actually literally on that app. There are tools and resources to take somebody as young as 10 and as old as 110, right, to on what things they need to do differently to maintain financial health and to be and to live a more prosperous financial life. So I would say just literally Google it,
Okay.
right? Literally take time to access resources in and around financial health, financial literacy. And there are age appropriate pathways. There are so many books, so many apps out there that for someone to say, well, I just didn't know what to do. But they spent 3 hours watching a movie or 10 hours on YouTube tells me, well, no, you're just, you're used the wrong search engines, right? Like it's out there
Yeah.
in a way that wasn't there for me when I was 16, but it is definitely there for not just 16, but like I said, a 10-year-old, a 12-year-old
Yeah.
can find the information that they need readily available. And also when in doubt, also have a conversation, whether it's Wells Fargo or any bank, there's so many just financial advisors out there that can be helpful as well.
Oh, thank you, Otis. So one last question about, are you optimistic? What's your view on, as people of color, Black people, in terms of where we're going, where things are situated right now? Are you positive or optimistic about or how positive and optimistic are you
I,
about the future?
I am very optimistic. I'm a realist, right? As a student of history, but I am more optimistic than I've ever been, partly because of some of the assaults that you're seeing happening right now on basic civil liberties, trying to ban books, all these types of crazy things that are happening. I really think it's a result of a heightened state of fear that things are changing and getting better. And so I'm very optimistic about our future. I look at the systems change that I've seen at Wells Fargo, and elsewhere. As I talk to my peers in the public and private sector, I'm really optimistic about our future.
Fantastic. I appreciate it, Otis. Thank you so very much. This is the Black Experience for all. If you like what you hear at the Black Experience, please consider clicking on the join button to support our nonprofit. I'm Adam P. Kennedy. Thank you for joining us.